The topic of the evening was transformation, or trauma as a gateway to transformation, something in that range. That was the title. So I was thinking about that. What does it actually mean? Well, first of all, what does transformation mean? So I looked at the meaning of transformation. And it revealed to me that in its ordinary meaning, the title is not particularly interesting or appropriate, because transformation means changing the form, transform. And if that was transformation then every cosmetic surgeon would be an agent of transformation, because they change people's form. But they change nothing essential about that person, as a matter of fact, maybe on the contrary. Then I thought about the Catholic word, transubstantiation, in which the Eucharist, the wine and the bread, they don't change form, but mysteriously and mystically they become the body of Christ. And I thought, well, that was more likely, because what does Jesus represent? He actually represents truth. And so through that act of faith, people find the truth. Well, I thought that was more interesting, so maybe I should call this trauma as a way to transubstantiation. But then I didn't think the Vatican would approve of that particular title. But it's very interesting about truth, because Jesus, when he meets Pontius Pilate, the Roman procurator, governor of Judea, according to the biblical story, Pilate asks him, "Who are you, or what do you do?" And Jesus says, "I'm here to teach or speak the truth," something like that. And Pilate says, "What is truth?" And I don't know if anybody remembers what Jesus' answer is. Does anyone remember what he says? He says nothing. He doesn't answer. Why doesn't he answer? Because he knows that Pilate, or if you want to get psychological about it, that part of us that Pilate represents, the egoistical, power-hungry, intellectual mind, cannot recognize the truth. So he doesn't even try to explain it to him. Because Jesus represents, if anything, the truth of the heart and the truth of the spirit. So, if transformation then represents a finding of the truth, then the truth about what? The truth about what? So, when I speak about trauma as a pathway to transformation, I'm not talking about anybody changing their form. I'm also not talking about anybody changing their substance. Like in the transubstantiation, the bread and the wine become the mystical body of Jesus. So the substance changes without the form changing. In ordinary sense of transformation, the form changes without the substance changing. In that religious sense, insofar as I can understand it, the substance changes without the form changing. But then we ask ourselves, what truth are we seeking? And ultimately, all religious, all spiritual pathways, and I should say also all psychological methods worth their salt, have the intention of guiding people to find the truth about themselves. Which means it's not that you're going to change your substance, it's you're going to find what your substance really is all about. Substantially, who are you? So that's the sense in which I'm intending this conversation tonight, of trauma as a doorway towards actually finding the genuine substance of yourself. of ourselves. This last week, I stayed for a couple of days in a beautiful place in the Cotswolds with a friend who told me the tragic reality that 2 weeks ago, one of her friends killed herself. And this friend who's relating the story told me that something invited her, in fact called her to go into the forest, this beautiful forest. And as she walked in the forest, she felt immense grief, and joy at the same time. Now you think, what possible joy could there be in the aftermath of such a tragic event? Because, my friend said, I was fully experiencing myself as alive, and that grief is a genuine aspect of who I am. And to experience that, to be able to feel all that, was a source of joy. Now, that may seem, I don't know, an arbitrary way of looking at it, but actually isn't. It turns out that just as we have brain circuits for joy and love and caring, we also have brain circuitry for grief. So grief is actually a part of who we are. Much of the problem with people, and much of the impact of trauma, is that people don't feel grief in a genuine sense. These people all took on their lives in a way that they had never had before. Now they may engage in yoga, like Valentina did, meditation, they may take supplements, they might change their diet fundamentally, they might go out in nature to commune with the plant world, they might exercise, they might walk. But the fundamental change in all these cases is their relationship to themselves, so that the disease actually becomes a doorway to themselves. Now, I don't recommend that way of learning. I don't recommend that way of learning at all. I don't recommend that anybody gets ill in order to discover themselves. All I'm saying is that once the illness comes along, one can see it as a nuisance to get rid of. And I mean, who wants to be ill and who wants to suffer? Or one can see it at the same time, at least, as the potential teacher, just like Valentina did. And the teaching is what? It's about who we actually are. And I can tell you that this happens even in cases where there's no remission, where people are dying. And I worked for 7 years in palliative care, working with terminally ill people. I had more than one person tell me, "Doc, this cancer, this is a week or two before their deaths." And they say to me, "Doctor, this cancer is the best thing that ever happened to me." Now, you wouldn't certainly wish that on anybody, but when you ask why, because I found out what was precious in life. And what was precious in life is their full experience of themselves as real beings, rather than some role that they were playing to please others or to please their own socially constructed expectations of themselves. So in my new book, The Myth of Normal, there's actually a chapter called Disease as Teacher. Now again, I don't recommend it. All I'm saying is that these traumatic events and these difficult experiences, we can use them as teachers, so we choose them to. I'd never say to anybody, "Oh, you got lupus, congratulations, what a teacher you've got." Or, "Thank God you got cancer, now you can discover who you really are." This is nothing you can impose on people, but you can guide people to ask the right questions. And people very often come to it themselves. So let me read you a quote by one of my favorite teachers. And this is a man called H. Almas, and this is what he says. Your conflicts, all the difficult things, the problematic situations in your life are not chance or haphazard. They're actually yours. They're specifically yours, designed specifically for you by a part of you that loves you more than anything else. That part of you that loves you more than anything else has created roadblocks to lead you to yourself. You're not going to go in the right directions unless there's something pricking you on the side telling you, look here, this way. That part of you loves you so much that it doesn't want you to lose the chance. It will go to extreme measures to wake you up. It will make you suffer greatly if you don't listen. What else can it do? That's its purpose. Now, again, this is not a perspective that you can impose on anybody, and I certainly can't impose it on you. I'm just inviting you to consider it. When I look at my own life, the things that on one level I most wish hadn't happened, they're also my greatest teachers. So I'll give you one example. I mentioned that I had the job of being medical coordinator of the palliative care unit at Vancouver's largest hospital. So I worked with terminally ill people. I did a lot of listening to them in their last days and weeks of life. One story that I tell in my book, When the Body Says No, is about a man who was the head of a company that sold shark cartilage as a treatment or a prevention for cancer. That's what he did. He sold this shark cartilage. At that time, there was this belief. I don't know if anybody still has that belief, but for a while there was kind of a popular myth that shark cartilage would cure or prevent cancer. And he was a man in his 40s. He was diagnosed with cancer, terminal cancer, and it killed him within 2 months of diagnosis. So he was admitted to a unit, and I looked after him. And he still kept eating this shark cartilage. And let me tell you, it smelled awful. It really stank. I mean, you entered the unit and you were just overwhelmed by the stench. And I went and talked to him, and I said, well, what does that stuff taste like? He says, it's awful, I hate it. I said, why do you keep eating it? Do you still think it's going to save your life? He says, no, I don't believe that for a second. But my business partner would be so disappointed if I stopped eating it. Very typical of the person who develops chronic illness, that they completely ignore their own needs in order to please others, to fit in with other people's expectations. So I did him the service of convincing him that with 2 weeks or less left to live, he doesn't have to devote his life to pleasing others. And he stopped eating this stuff. But the story I wanted to tell you has to do with me, which is that I got fired from that job. And I argued that I was fired for gross competence. I was just too good at it, you know. And actually, in a sense, that was true, because I was very unorthodox, you know, and I just did whatever I thought would be appropriate, which may or may not be according to medical protocol, and it really worked most of the time. But my colleagues wouldn't necessarily understand what I was doing, and when they asked, you know, why are you doing it that way, I took that as a challenge, and as a criticism, as an argument. So I would respond like a bulldog to an attack. Now, when I was fired, all I could see was the injustice. Because all the things they were criticizing me for, there were things that had been major successes in terms of the client's trajectory and well-being. So I just was livid with this sense of injustice, and for weeks that's all I could think about, and I could only plot how I would drag them to court and grind their faces into the dust and gain a glorious victory of revenge and validation and vindication. You know how the mind can do this stuff. What stopped me from going down that track was that I just got my first book contract for the book that became Scattered Minds. And I actually realized that I had a decision to make. I could either write a book or I could wage a legal battle, but I couldn't do both at the same time. So I reluctantly gave up the crusade. But only later did I realize that for a whole number of reasons, that firing was one of the best thing that ever happened to me. First of all, although I wasn't ready to acknowledge it right away, it took me a while. But I saw I had created my own firing. Nobody intended to fire me. They didn't set out with ill will towards me. There may have been some jealousy and some misunderstanding and lack of curiosity about what I was doing properly. But really, there was no ill will as such, and had I responded in a different way, the firing never would have happened. So it doesn't matter that I was right about the issues per se. I was completely wrong about the process, which had to do with respecting other people's differences and respecting their skepticism or their lack of understanding. That was totally on me. That was my egoic mind showing up, trying to be right. But there's something deeper that I understood, that this feeling in my body, all that was swirling in my belly and my chest, all associated with these thoughts of injustice, there's nothing new about that. I'd known that all my life. All that happened was that this particular firing triggered for me all the suppressed rage that I'd carried all my life. In other words, a deep traumatic imprint for much earlier on. So here's an example where a potentially difficult, problematic situation, to quote Almas, actually turned out to be my best teacher. Something in me guided me to get myself fired so I could learn what I needed to learn. Not to mention, quite possibly, if that firing hadn't happened, I might not be standing in front of you right now. Because 4 or 5 weeks later, I got a phone call from the downtown east side of Vancouver. They needed a job at this dirty hotel called the Portland Hotel, working with addicted population with mental illness and HIV. And had I had kept the palliative care job, I wouldn't have time to take on this other one, which led to some of my deepest medical experiences and writings. That's just my personal experience. My personal experience also is that the conflicts in my marriage, and believe me, there have been plenty, but I can tell you that after 55 years of a relationship now, every struggle we had, upsetting as it was at the time, and as discombobulating as we experienced it, and as hostile and as hurt as each of us might have felt, when we actually looked at it from the point of view of what is true, there was a deep teaching in it. Deep, deep teaching in it. Now, the Greek playwright Aeschylus, in his play The Agamemnon, has got a line where the Greek chorus says that the way the master or Zeus created us, human beings, we have to suffer into truth. Some people have it more fortunate. Few do. They will arrive at the truth, the realization, the self-awareness, the true self of who they are through grace. Most of us are not in that category. Most of us have to suffer into truth. And then it becomes a question of how should we regard suffering? Should we regard it as an enemy or as a potential guide? Now, I want to make a distinction. I'm not talking about the suffering of a Palestinian child in Gaza being bombed by the Israeli Air Force. I'm not talking about the suffering of a Ukrainian child being bombed by the Russian Air Force. I'm not talking about the suffering of a person of color in a racist society. I'm not saying that this suffering is a great thing, that something pricking them in the side, leading them back to themselves. No, that suffering is imposed from the outside, unfairly and unjustifiably. I'm talking about the suffering which we actually create for ourselves, unwittingly, not deliberately, not because we're culpable, not because we're stupid either. As a matter of fact, a lot of the suffering they experience, a lot of the suffering that we experience is actually a manifestation of the wisdom of the human organism. Now, how can suffering be a manifestation of the of the wisdom of the human organism? Well, that man who sold shark cartilage, he didn't start out life pleasing everybody. As I have often asked audiences, have you ever met the one-day-old baby who will suppress their own needs in order to please others? You know, I'm hungry and I'm wet and I'm lonely, but mom and dad have been working so hard all day, I better not bother them right now with my petty little hungers and needs, you know. No, they'll scream out their needs. But something happens. Something happens between how we're born and then, as we end up as adults, eating this terrible concoction simply to please somebody else. That something that happens is actually a manifestation of the wisdom of the human organism. Valentina, I'm sure if I'd asked her more about her personality before the onset of her various illnesses and symptoms, and before the initiation of her transformative self-inquiry, would probably have told me that she was one of these people that suppressed their own needs, that everybody would have seen as pretty nice, that didn't know how to experience healthy anger or how to manifest it when necessary, who's probably concerned with responsibility for how other people feel and a compulsive fear of disappointing anybody. I've just described, by the way, the disease-prone personality. Now, how does that develop, though? Well, again, this is what I talk about, the wisdom of the human organism, because as children, we have two essential needs. Well, we have a number of needs, but in this case, I'm talking about two needs that, when aligned with each other, are tremendously supportive, and when they're in conflict, they're tremendously disruptive. So the primary need we do have as infants, as not just as human beings, but as mammals, is we have this need to attach, to belong to somebody, to be taken care of. Otherwise, we obviously don't survive. As humans, being the most helpless, least developed, and most dependent, and least mature for the longest period of time, creatures in the universe. So this need for attachment that we have is wired into our brains. And we are meant to experience grief and panic when those attachment needs are withdrawn. That's a good thing. Because if I experience panic as an infant, I'm going to scream. And that scream should bring the parents running to meet my needs. The parents, in turn, in their brain, there's a circuitry for, I'm here, by the way, quoting a great neuroscientist called Dr. Jaak Panksepp, who is one of the great neuroscientists of the last half century at least. And we have these brain circuits that we share with other animals. We have a system for care, which actually impels us to look after the vulnerable. That's part of our nature. He actually capitalizes these circuitry, care, C-A-R-E, panic, grief, and so on. We have other circuits as well. So we have this need to be taken care of, and the nurturing figures have this drive to take care of us. That's called attachment, the connection for the purpose of being taken care of, or of taking care of the other. Well, that's good. But we also, and we also have a need for what I call authenticity. Now, what is authenticity? Authenticity comes from the Greek word auto, the self. So we have the need to be ourselves. Now, that's not an airy-fairy New Age concept. It's a literal physical need, for the very simple reason that how we evolved as human beings was not in cities and so on. We developed out there in nature, in small band hunter-gatherer groups. And if the existence of just our own species could be measured in an hour, then until 6 minutes ago, we lived as hunter-gatherers out there in nature. Now, if we're not in touch with our gut feelings, just how long do we survive out there? How long does any creature in the wild survive without their gut feelings? So that's not a negotiable need either. And that's authenticity, just being in touch with ourselves, fully, with our bodies, with our feelings, and having the capacity to act on that information that our feelings give us, our gut feelings give us. So we have the need for authenticity, we have the need for attachment. That's fine. But what happens if our environment, and by the way, I've done this with many audiences, let me do it with you here. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you've had the experience of having a powerful gut feeling about something, ignoring it, and being sorry afterwards. Just raise your hand, okay? I mean, it's the vast majority of the audience. The story you just told me is about your childhood. Because you were born perfectly in touch with your gut feelings. If you're at all a healthy infant, you were born perfectly in touch with your gut feelings. At a certain point, you had to learn that you better not pay attention to that. Even if you feel the gut feeling, don't heed it. Why? Because doing so might put you at odds with your environment. Your nurturing figures may not be able to accept who you really are. And who you really are is what you're feeling at that moment. So a lot of parenting experts and psychologists will tell parents how to deal with an angry child. And most of that advice has to do with coercing the child out of their anger. In other words, forcing the child, for the sake of attachment to the parents, to suppress their gut feelings and their actual experience of themselves. This happens almost automatically in this society. So then we lose touch with ourselves. There's a wisdom in that. The wisdom is that it helps you maintain your attachments to the people that you're dependent upon. So it's not a mistake on your part that you suppressed yourself. No, it wasn't an act of stupidity. It was an act of deep wisdom on the part of nature and your own particular organism. The trouble is that that same adaptation, which helped you maintain your attachment relationships, exact a heavy price later on in life, in the form of mental health, in the form of physical illness, in the form of relationship issues, in the form of not knowing yourself, in the form of behaviors that you don't even understand anymore. And then you're like Dante, who wrote the Divine Comedy, and that beautiful, difficult, but magnificent poem, one of the great creations of world literature, begins with a midlife crisis. Dante finds himself all of a sudden in a dark forest. He's lost. He says, I don't know how I got lost. And I don't know how to get out of here. Basically, he's lost the connection to himself. He doesn't know how to regain his true self, and he has to then go through hell first. He has to deal with the trauma. has to deal with all the dark stuff, all the shadowy stuff, before he can emerge into the light and go through purgatory and finally enter the divine light. So the way through transformation in the Divine Comedy begins with a loss of self and a loss of connection, or an awareness of that. Who am I anyway? And then a reconnection by going through the shadows of Inferno. And that's kind of what Aeschylus was also talking about, that we have to suffer into truth. Now, what does all this have to do with trauma? Well, that depends very much on how you understand trauma. If you understand trauma as bad things happening to you, what I'm saying doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if you understand trauma the way I see it, and I'm not unique in seeing it this way, trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. So the word trauma itself comes from a Greek word for wound. Trauma is a wound. So trauma is a psychic wounding. So when I'm walking around the park near my home, consumed by revenge fantasies and deep hurt about my firing, what's actually happening is that a very early psychic wound of life being very unfair and me suffering for no reason that I can figure out. That's what gets triggered. So trauma is this wound that you sustain. It's not what happened to you, it's what happened inside you as a result of what happened to you. And I'm not the first one to say this, but the greatest aspect of trauma is the loss of connection to yourself. And that's the truth then, that you spend so much effort to rediscover, who am I anyway? And that's the transformation. So it's not that you become a different substance. It's that you actually find out the substance that you actually are. That's the challenge. The trauma disconnected from us that, but it's by dealing with the trauma, by understanding it, by recognizing it, that we can actually reconnect. So I'll quote you again from this same teacher, Almas, and he says, give me a moment here, the fundamental thing that happened, and the greatest calamity is not that there was no love or support. The greater calamity, which was caused by that first calamity, is that you lost the connection to your essence. That is much more important than whether your mother or father loved you or not. So, your mother or father may have loved you. In fact, most parents love their kids, but they also hurt you. And they may have hurt you by overt means, such as, in all too many cases, abuse and violence and, addictive patterns and just, my son, Daniel, he used to have this recurrent nightmare in his childhood that the floor just fell away, there was no floor. He says, he never knew when the floor was not the floor. And what he was talking about was not abuse. What he was talking about, he never knew when his parents would get into a very rancorous and very fused conflict, which just charged the whole atmosphere with anger and fear, which this sensitive child then had to absorb and deal with. So the trauma is not just about how do we deal with all that. Well, we deal with all that. It's too much to experience. As infants, as young children, it's too much to experience. You can tell how conflictual a marriage is by at least two ways. One is, you can ask the parents, how is your relationship? The other is you can measure the child's stress hormone levels in their urine. Thanks all for coming. Thank you.